Hello, everybody. Welcome to Global Ethics. We're moving into the topic of moral relativism. In this particular week, in this article you guys read last week, was on cultural relativism. Okay, so I'm working on your midterms now. I probably have about half of them graded, and they look good so far. You guys are doing well. So my plan is to have those graded by the end of this week. So, you can check Scholar periodically because as I'm grading them, I'm updating the grades. Or you can just check at the end of this week, and by the end of the week, it may be the weekend. But your grades will be in there. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the Rachel's article that we looked at last week. And Rachel's sets out to sort of provide an account of what cultural relativism is, and then he analyzes sort of what he thinks are the claims of cultural relativism to see if they actually hold up to scrutiny. So he starts off with providing some examples that he thinks provides pretty compelling case for cultural relativism. The first one is the example of the Colossians and the Greeks, and this was portrayed in a story by Herodotus in his histories. And basically it's in Persia. King Darius hears that the Colossians have this practice of eating their dead, basically. And they believe that they could keep their ancestors living by ingesting their bodies. Whereas the Greeks thought that the spirit moved on and the body should be destroyed so that the spirit can get full rest, full closure. So here you have an example of two different people who hold two different beliefs regarding the way that you should treat your dead. But when you get down to it, it seems that they both have reasons, reasonable reasons, I suppose, if you think that eating your dead is, to keep your ancestors going is reasonable. I mean, in some ways, it can be just as reasonable as believing that your body turns into you turn into a spirit after you die. But anyway, they at least had some explanatory factors to why they believed that they should eat their dead, whether you agree with it or not. That's, I guess that points to the whole point of cultural relativism. But the point that Rachel's is trying to make is just because, and he also Vaughn talks about this article in the Vaughn book that we read earlier. Just because you have two different worldviews doesn't mean that one of those worldviews is not necessarily right. So another example that Rachel's looks at is the example of Eskimos, and he talks about some of the Eskimos' different cultural practices regarding relationships and marriage. But the one that he really wants to point out is the infanticide, where Eskimos have been known to kill their children. And then later on he goes on to explain some reasons why they may have done that. And he was saying to us as Americans or to Westerners, that seems like a barbaric practice. But when you actually get into sort of the reasoning behind why the Eskimos doing it, it may make sense. Okay, so Rachel's provides 5 claims that he thinks sort of provide the basis, or 5 claims that cultural relativism supports, and that he thinks provide the basis for the argument of cultural relativism. The first one is that different societies have different moral codes. This seems pretty basic. The Colossians, thought that eating your dead was acceptable, and the Greeks thought that it was an abomination. So there you have two different moral codes. But one of the things that Rachel goes to some lengths to point out is, although there are differences in moral codes, there are also many aspects of each society's moral code that's similar. Like, for example, there are no societies on earth where murder is something to be encouraged. There are no societies where theft is something to be encouraged. And the reason for that actually goes back to Kant, too, is Kant argued that this leads to a type of contradiction. If you have a society where we're saying, yeah, everybody should tell a lie, then basically what you're doing is you're creating a society. Even that statement, everybody should tell a lie, should be a lie. So it's sort of self-refuting. The same way with murder. If you live in a society where murder is something that's encouraged, then you're constantly going to be on the lookout. You probably never leave your house. You can't interact with other people to trade and things like that. So there are certain things that are in place that are necessary for society to function. So, murder being wrong is one of them. Lying is another one. Theft is another one. These things all seem to be common. So this claim that different societies have different moral codes is true to a point. Okay. The second point that he brings up is this idea of it's the moral code that decides ultimately what's right in a society. And once again, he goes back to the Eskimo example here. And he says that Eskimos don't want to kill their children. That's always the last option in this particular case. And even as last option, it seems unacceptable to us. But the idea is that, mothers have to nurse their infants for a long time. And it says that the majority of the infants that are killed are the females. And the reasoning behind that was, for one thing, the majority of the hunters who provided the food were men. So they needed the men to provide food. And they only had sort of limited amounts of, resources that they could provide to people. So the men, being the ones who, brought in the food, they were deemed more valuable. And that's, we have serious problems with that in our society. And, I would argue rightly so. But and then the other thing was that if the females, so the males went out and did the hunting, and because that was a dangerous activity, many of the males were killed. So if you had a society, where you had equal, you have the men going out, you have equal numbers of men and women being born. The men are going out to do the hunting. The men are getting killed in greater numbers. You're going to end up in a society where there are more women than there are men, and that leads to some problems in the society as far as when it comes to reproducing and things like that. So those were some of the arguments that the Eskimos would give. Obviously they were living in very harsh conditions. The resources were very limited. So instead of letting their child, starve to death, or letting all of their children starve to death, they essentially make the choice to let one of the infants die or to kill one of the infants in order to, ensure greater survival. So you can see in that particular case, you can see a type of consequentialism coming in. You're doing the greatest good for the greatest number. And whether that justifies killing babies or not, I don't know. But anyway, the point being, the second point, that the moral code is what determines what is right in society, it's not necessarily true, Rachel's is saying, because he thinks that the Eskimos' morality would still be to protect the infants, but the external factors and the environmental truths and consequences that take place in that society actually determine the action that they have to take. It's really a necessity. It goes back to the survival question. The third claim is that there are no universal truths in ethics. And basically this is the central claim of cultural relativism, that all moral truths are relative to the particular culture, and there are no universal truths that supersede that culture. There are problems with that. Obviously, we've already talked about one, the thing about murder and lying and theft. Those seem to be universal if you want your society to succeed or to even exist. That society cannot exist without those basic truths, if you want to call them, or guidelines or rules. Another thing that Rachel talks about is when you're talking about things like slavery or genocide, if you want to condemn those things, as most people want to do, then you're going to have to appeal to something greater than your own culture's moral code. So, something to think about there. Basically, the fourth one says that a moral code has no special status, meaning, so not one person's moral code has a special status. So, like, the American moral code does not supersede, the Iranian moral code or something like that. Because once again, we get back to this point where there are no universal truths. None are better than the others. They're just simply different. And that leads into the fifth point, which says that it's arrogant for anybody from any culture to judge another culture when it comes to a moral idea, because moral